If you work with people, maybe as a counselor or a therapist or a coach, then you must have experienced the rigidity of how people can get stuck. How people can get stuck in a loop of dysfunction and suffering. And maybe you have these clients who return week after week, every time with a new insight, with new understanding, and new stories that they are telling, new narratives to explain their own dysfunction. And although they might be able to tell the story of their own trauma or their own dysfunction really fluently and eloquently, nothing seems to really change. Welcome to the Trance Movement podcast, where we will be exploring altered states of consciousness through somatic healing practices, embodied spirituality, and what all of that means for your personal path and life. Hi there, my name is Aernoudt, and in this episode I want to shed some light on what I would like to call the storytelling trap. And I think many people can relate to this, whether you are working as a counselor or a therapist or a coach, or you're just helping out a family member or a friend, that people can often have tremendous insight and understanding in their situation, their victimhood, their dysfunction or stuckness. But at the same time, you notice that despite all that insight and understanding, maybe the body is still tightening. Maybe the person is still defensive or reactive or avoidant. Or worse, the very fluency of their story, the way that they have learned how to tell it so convincingly, becomes sort of a cage, constantly re-traumatizing themselves. They become sort of locked into this narrative of what was done to them. The story can even be so compelling and well rehearsed that it becomes habitual and that it hardens into an identity. They're not stuck in trauma, they're stuck in the story about trauma. And every time they tell it, every time they gain more insight into it, they're actually reinforcing the bars of the cage. You have probably felt this tension, maybe in your work, and I see it everywhere in the work that I do with people. Many people seem to still believe that talking really works, and if you can articulate the story, if you can understand the patterns and gain insight into why you do what you do, that something will shift. And sometimes it does, but often it doesn't. Now, if we take a look at decades of research in neuroscience and psychology, for example, split brain research and studies on introspection and motivation confabulation, as Nick Chater has done in his book The Mind is Flat, we have to draw a bit of a shocking conclusion. Much of what we think of as deep introspection may actually be just improvised explanation. Michael Gazzaniga, for example, after doing extensive split brain studies, described the language centers of the brain as being the brain's PR office, not its CEO. You see, the CEO never actually seems to talk to the PR office. It just acts. And then the PR office starts to scramble together the best commentary it can think of. Chater goes even further to say that there is no inner library of beliefs and desires waiting to be discovered. Instead, your mind seems to be a brilliant improviser. The moment someone asks you why you did something, your brain generates an explanation. It feels true, it's compelling, but it's fabricated in that instant, not excavated from some hidden depth. You know that moment when you catch your friend or partner or maybe your client explaining something, but you feel that it doesn't quite fit. Their brain seems to be working overtime to make sense of a choice that they've already made. They aren't introspecting, they are improvising, or at least to a certain degree. You know, according to decades of research in neuroscience and psychology, much of what we call introspection may actually be post hoc interpretation. Not a window into your depths, but a performance. A story your brain spins in real time to justify what has already happened. Of course, language and insight can be deeply valuable, don't get me wrong. Naming experiences matters. Understanding patterns matters. We do have sharing circles between our trance movement journeys, for example. But insight alone is often not enough to reorganize your nervous system. You can't think your way out of a problem that wasn't created by thinking in the first place. Now, there's something important to understand here. This victim narrative, it doesn't come from deep introspection. It came from the brain's need to make sense of pain, to create some form of coherence out of chaos. But now this narrative has become so automatic, so ever present, that it starts to feel like the truth. Sometimes it can even feel like the deepest thing about you. But you see, it's a fabrication. It's a post hoc story that your brain tells to justify emotional and somatic patterns that actually live somewhere else entirely. And so we get stuck in the past, constantly retelling that story in the present. And this isn't just my experience as a facilitator, the research confirms this. In his landmark work, The Body Keeps the Score, Dutch psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk documents what many therapists are discovering the hard way. Trauma and deep patterns aren't stored as narratives in your mind. They're stored in your nervous system, in your muscles, in your breath, and in the felt sense of your body. Talk therapy often fails precisely because it never reaches where the real information lives. You can gain perfect insight into your story and still be trapped in your somatic patterns. You know, the body has its own intelligence. It doesn't lie in the way that language sometimes does. It doesn't confabulate. It simply holds what has happened, and it holds the patterns that you have developed to survive. Talking about survival strategies won't dissolve them. moving through them, breathing into them, really feeling them with full presence. Now, that's different. That's accessing the source. And this is the reason why nowadays so many therapeutic modalities are starting to move towards more somatic and experiential approaches, and also the reason why I train trance movement facilitators. Exactly because it is such a powerful approach. What I have learned in working with thousands of people over decades in altered states, blindfolded, moving to rhythm and sound and breathing, is that when you allow people to surrender to the music and the rhythm and the wisdom of their own bodies, that the storytelling apparatus will start to quiet down. And when this happens, they are no longer in this domain of the language centers, the public relations office, but they're in direct contact with what their body actually knows. There is no narrative layer to filter through, no ego defending its version of events, just breath and movement, sensation and presence. And it's in that space where things really shift, not because they've gained understanding or a new insight, but because they are accessing something deeper than insight. They are accessing the actual lived experience as it's stored in their nervous system. In a way, the body is the subconscious. And once the body can experience something different, the mind will start to tell a different story.